The Lonely Mountain may be the geological feature that the faction takes its name from, but the Dwarves of Erebor are not only from this place, as at the time that we are most concerned about in the Third Age, in and around the War of the Ring, under the reign of King Dain, this also includes his older realms from the Iron Hills, so a little bit more widespread perhaps than just a single location, as is the case with Khazad-dûm. They perhaps bear closer resemblance in a more complete sense to the Dwarves of Ered Luin in the far west of Middle-earth. Erebor as well, in terms of the War of the Ring, were far more in the firing line for Sauron's invading forces, purely because all of his thralls in the east of Middle-earth, under the banners mostly of men, also marched on the north, and alongside their Dalian allies, Erebor had to put up a real struggle there, and obviously the long friendship, for the most part, between the Dwarves of Erebor and the Bardings of Dale is something that you can actually see play out in both of their rosters as well, because much like Angmar and Rhudaur, they do have a tendency to complement one another and fill one another's gaps relatively well. And we'll move on to speaking about what Erebor are capable of doing on the field now by talking about some more general strengths and weaknesses, as has become the way we do things here in these faction overviews, starting off with the strengths. And I would say that Erebor's greatest strength is maybe not the obvious thing, and that is their crossbows and axe throwers. This is more of a supporting unit, so in a similar vein to Ered Luin in the west as well. Perhaps the thing that stands out about them most is not purely their upfront muscle, but the things they place around that to really deliver that to the enemy. And in Erebor's case, that is in their short to mid-range skirmishing. Both of these two things also play off against one another rather well. The crossbows can punch through armour and shields, whereas the throwing axes can't, but they have a far greater base damage to work with. This obviously does come at a cost, because Erebor do have a very clearly defined weakness elsewhere in their ranged core, which we'll get onto a little bit later. But when it comes to their selection of crossbows and axe throwers, they have some very good mainline offerings, and in both classes of units there's a very real case for saying that Erebor have the best example of a crossbow unit and the best example of an axe thrower unit, though that is the sort of thing which we will go into greater depth about at a later date. But it gives them a huge amount of damage that they can do at those sort of mid-ranges inwards, to say nothing of their second strength, which we're going to list, which is sort of the thing that you would expect from every Dwarven faction, that is their heavy infantry. They're very accomplished when it comes to their melee fighting, and it's really general across the board infantry that I'm going to be mentioning here as well. In a similar vein to how we've spoke about Rohan and Dol Amrot's cavalry in the past, it's not any one class, it's more all-round, and Erebor have got access to some very good pikes. Their line infantry units, as you would expect from a Dwarven faction, are also very strong, and they also have access to some more aggressive infantry as well, both at a low level and at a higher level. Though it is worth mentioning as a bit of a caveat that Erebor have, perhaps on foot at the very least, less access to pure infantry bodyguards than they used to. That is more the domain now of Khazad-dûm exclusively, but much like Ered Luin as well, they have one singular sort of dedicated melee bodyguard unit on foot, and the other examples are, you know, hybridized units which fold in to the main line, which can also get involved in melee, and we'll see examples of that when we look at the roster up close. But it's an overall sort of plus point, really, their infantry. They're very hard to wear down, as you would expect of the dwarves. They're also very capable of dishing out heavy punishment in melee, so if you combine that with the supporting tools we just mentioned, they can be a very fearsome foe to fight, especially in more narrow terrain, as you would expect as well of Dwarven factions in general. But they're not just limited to that sort of thing either. I would say Erebor, especially among the Dwarves, have got a bit of a focus, or at least a plus point, shall we say, in cavalry and chariot support. Now, their cavalry force is potent, but it is expensive, relatively small, and if you are up against a faction which prioritises its cavalry more, then going cavalry heavy probably isn't the call as Erebor, because they are a little bit better when it comes to dealing damage and supporting the rest of their army, rather than going forth on their own and being that vanguard force that you would see from certainly some of the Kingdoms of Men. In Erebor's case, it is much more to complement, I think, their main army, especially when you consider the chariots. Very much a flash-in-the-pan kind of unit. They wield crossbows as well, as they also have those armour-piercing bolts that are going to be contributing to EREBOR's overall advance, but it's all about choosing when to commit these sorts of units. And if you can do that at the right time, especially in conjunction with the crossbows and throwing axes, then you'll cause horrendous damage to your opposition. And at that point, they're in a real hole when they're facing down, the very powerful infantry that EREBOR also have. So cavalry and chariots are good for EREBOR, but that does come with the caveat that you have to use them in conjunction with the other tools that you have in order for them to be truly effective. But I would say that it's certainly an easier thing with EREBOR than it is perhaps with Ered Luin and certainly with Khazad-dûm, who have next to no cavalry support, only mercenaries. But again, more on them later. EREBOR, however, the dwarves, I think, when it comes to weaknesses, are fairly clearly defined. They certainly have some universal ones across the three dwarven factions that are in the game. But there are also some unique ones, and I think the EREBOR one that stands out the most, I did mention last time around that Angmar may very well be the weakest long-range faction in the game, but they're not. That is EREBOR, because they don't have access to archers, and that is obviously a significant thing, because it means that at long ranges you are going to be completely reliant on artillery, which is fine. The dwarves do have access to some good artillery. The Iron Ballista is a good example of such, so you can still pressurize your enemy from afar, but you're not going to be able to stand and shoot at all. You are going to have to move into the firing line a little bit. It's one of the reasons why EREBOR on the open field can be a little bit awkward to work with, because you have to try and manufacture that engagement for yourself, where you're very potent, where you've got the enemy within your radius of your skirmishers, which are closer range, and then your infantry, which means inevitably you're going to run into a phase of the battle where you're taking damage, but you're not really able to give it out to your opposition. And that is where things can get a little bit dangerous if you maneuver incorrectly, and you can't return fire. It's obviously a problem, but EREBOR is so strong when it comes to that mid-range, inwards ranged fire that's the trade-off you make. There aren't really factions that are going to be able to hang with EREBOR in that regard, just because they have the crossbows and the throwing projectiles, whereas with most other factions it's kind of one or the other when you consider Cardalum with the crossbows or Rudaur with the javelins and throwing axes. EREBOR have both, but they then don't have an archer force, which is obviously going to be a problem for some, but it just means that you have to be, at least initially, a little bit aggressive and a little bit swift. But that brings us on to another issue with the dwarves, shall we say. More limited mobility is how I've phrased it, but it's kind of a difficult one to discern, because they do have that cavalry and chariot support that they have with their armies. They do have maybe some other fast movers that the other dwarves maybe, depending on composition, would find a little bit more difficult to deal with. But ultimately, because of their lack of archers and because of their focus around heavier infantry and infantry-based armies in general, manoeuvring around can be a little bit of a struggle. You have to set yourself up just so. That's not so much of a problem in a siege, because it's a lot more telegraphed where people are going to be going, and a lot more limited what both sides' options are, whether you're attacking or defending. But on the open field, this can be an issue for EREBOR, because if the opposition are doing their due diligence and they're utilising longer range skirmishers and using mobility and swifter units, then you can end up being kited as an entire army, which is not the sort of thing which other factions may have to deal with as well. The risk is lower for other factions than it is with EREBOR in this regard. It's still not likely. In all likelihood, you will be able to force an engagement eventually, but it's just a case of how much damage you sustain while you're doing that. And the final thing to mention is something which we seem to be mentioning quite a lot lately, but it's just par for the course really when you're talking about the Arnorians and Angmar. Vulnerable to armor piercing. This shouldn't really be surprising for the dwarves either, considering how they're built and what they're all about. Armor is going to be a big selling point for them, and obviously it does come with its advantages, but it does mean that if you see that you're lining up against EREBOR, or indeed any of the dwarven factions, any armor piercing you have in your roster is absolutely the sort of thing that you should be bringing, and shock infantry units are a little bit easier to keep safe from EREBOR, at least initially in the battle, because of their lack of archers, though when you do commit them they have to stay committed, because otherwise they're going to be in the radius of those devastating throwing axes, and as soon as that becomes the case, you're going to end up losing even some of your stronger, more elite shock infantry to them. Armor piercing across the board though, cavalry, off the charge, can also be devastating to EREBOR if you're able to sweep away their own mounted support. It's just the sort of thing that's definitely worth keeping an eye on throughout the battle, because if you do allow those armor piercing units to start gaining ground, that is one of the ways in which you're very solid, very potent infantry force can start to become undone against certain opposition. And Erebor's numbers are not limitless, but the dwarves are maybe not as susceptible to that sort of thing as some of the elves are. But now, let's go and take a look at Erebor on the grassy plain in a bit more detail. So Erebor also continue the trend of the dwarves having relatively concise rosters. They do have a couple of units that can upgrade their armour as well, but for the most part Erebor do come equipped with some of the finest dwarven plate anyway, and you can kind of see where the balance of their roster lies. I mean, they do have a relatively small selection actually of dedicated infantry, but as I mentioned in the strengths and weaknesses, it is very much really in these supporting units where they can really bolster the effectiveness of the slightly smaller selection of infantry that they do have, which again is more in line with what Ered Luin are all about than Khazad-dûm, as we will speak about at a later date. But we'll get right in with some of their units, and a unit which is shared across all of the Dwarven factions, so we won't spend too much time on them because we already saw them in Ered Luin, and we will go on to see them again in Khazad-dûm, and that is the Dwarven Miners, which are the entry-level Dwarven force, and they run contrary to a lot of what many of the dwarves are all about, in the sense that they are relatively squishy in the grand scheme of things. I mean, their armour values are decent for a unit which is relatively low end. 450 is the sort of thing that you would expect from entry-level Orcish units as a cost, but they do have lower numbers than them, and ultimately the effectiveness against armour for a unit which is this cheap is really the standout thing. And in terms of their stats overall, again, their armour scores are a little bit higher than what you would expect for a unit of this cost. Their attack and charge bonus is about on par for what you would expect as well. But the main thing that you would bring them for is, of course, their relatively low cost and relatively high numbers for a unit which does come with that armour piercing as standard. But it's on here onwards where we will see Erebor take on an identity all of their own, starting off with the Ironfoot Warriors, which admittedly, in terms of what they offer, is pretty similar to what entry-level Dwarven units from the other two factions will also offer you, and that is, for a relatively low cost and reasonably high numbers for what they are, maybe not reaching the numbers of some of the entry-level Kingdoms of Men, but certainly higher than what you will get from some of the entry-level Elven units, for example. Really good stats across the board. Their attacking values are reasonably high, and their defensive values are obviously where they will really come into their own. It allows them to hold out against units of a similar tier or a tier below them and really outperform them, but also their numbers mean that they can also go toe-to-toe with units that are a little bit more expensive and maybe a little bit better than themselves, just based upon that good defensive score and the fact that, you know, there are a decent number of them. You can also upgrade the armour of the Ironfoot Warriors, and their decent attack score is not based purely, I knew that was going to happen at some point, is not based purely on the fact that at the entry level they wield an axe, because when you upgrade the armour, their weaponry also changes and they wield a sword instead. But it gives their total defense score of 20, which is a nice round number. A decent amount of that is from their shields, but combine that with their armour and it means that they're going to be very resilient to arrow fire from afar as well, which is always a good thing for a unit of standard line infantry to have, because you want them to be efficient more than anything else, and that does mean soaking up range damage as well for a reasonably low outlay, and that is what you can expect from the Ironfoot Warriors. Something else that you can expect that from is the entry-level unit of pikes that they have as well. The Ironfoots here, significantly more expensive. In all fairness, they could have gone in the tier above, but because they're an Ironfoot unit, they kind of belong on this level. But they are the most expensive Ironfoot unit for a good reason. 750 for a unit of regular pikes may seem reasonably high, but this is the sort of cost that you can also expect from upgraded Witch-Realm pikemen, the Uruk-hai pikemen as well. The main difference, of course, being that the Ironfoots have slightly lower numbers, but also the stats across the board are a little bit higher as well. That phalanx formation is the all-important thing. The bonus fighting cavalry is a given. But the armour score is high, but what really sets them apart is, of course, that shield value. You can mass them up more easily than the likes of the Hranadine pikemen of Rudau that we've already taken a look at as well. So all of those things put together mean that Erebor have, even in the absence of any sort of spear unit, they have a very solid frontline force that also has that anti-cavalry capability that comes along with it. We'll go on to the crossbows a bit later, but that's also another way in which they can deal with enemy cavalry as well. But yeah, Ironfoot pikes, very resilient, get around some of the main weaknesses that standard units of pikes are kind of known for, but still maintain all of the same strengths, if not more so, because of the way that the dwarves just tend to be slightly more solid, and the shield value, of course. And yeah, armor value of 8 is not sky high, but it's high enough for this kind of unit, especially when you combine it with the shield value. The attack of 8 is also not half bad, but it's what you would kind of expect from a unit of pikes when you start to pay this amount. It's more the lower end pikes that tend to have fairly meagre attacking scores. Now then, moving on to the higher tiers of infantry that you have outside of the bodyguard unit, starting off with the more aggressive one. If you want an armor-piercing unit that is not the lowly dwarven miners, then the Sons of Durin are what you are going to be utilising as EREBOR. As you would expect, they are effective against armour when they wield those large warhammers, and also something which is fairly commonplace among higher tier and bodyguard tier shock infantry units is the ability to frighten nearby enemy infantry, which is always nice because it means that as you sort of gain momentum and enemy units start to break, you can really start to hammer that advantage home with a unit such as this. 800 is a fairly high cost for a unit which is ultimately going to have some defensive deficiencies in the sense they don't have a shield, but you know, the armor score is high, the defensive skill also for a unit of armor piercing shock infantry is also high, so that does get around, again, one of the main weaknesses that the class of unit tends to have. EREBOR as a general rule are suffering from that a little bit less, and of course the attack score and the charge bonus of 20, 18 and 20 in tandem. If you can land that charge bonus, these guys can be absolutely devastating as long as they still have a decent amount of their unit left alive. And yeah, the base attack score of 18, when you consider the armor-piercing nature of them, against the appropriate opposition, they can be really, really devastating. But just in general, if you need a bit of damage on foot, these are the guys that you're going to be turning to when you need that with a bit of numbers. We'll get onto the bodyguard unit in just a moment. But if you need a little bit of defensive nous, then the EREBOR Legionaries are going to be where you're going to be hanging your hat. Again, 900 is quite a lot for a unit of line infantry, which are going to be placing a greater emphasis on defence. They can also inspire nearby troops, which can be important as the dwarves, because while they are stout-hearted, they aren't the greatest in terms of numbers, which means that when you do approach that cliff edge, they can be made to rout. But if you do have the EREBOR Legionaries around you, the threshold for that is going to be a little bit higher, and I think 9 times out of 10 you are going to see these guys on the field, just because EREBOR don't have the widest selection of infantry. I think that you're going to be seeing the higher tier offerings more often than not. So the inspiration effect is nice. The attack score of 15 is also high for a unit of line infantry, but I would argue, they wield axes, so that's also going to be something that you're going to see. But also for a unit that costs 900, you're going to want an attack score that's reasonably high, because they're not going to have to rely solely on their defensive score. They are going to need to get involved when it comes to the damage dealing stakes, but that isn't going to be so much of a problem for these guys. But it is of course the defensive score where things start to rocket up a little bit more, maybe less so in defensive skill, but a total defense of 30 outside of a bodyguard unit is relatively rare. The shield value of course has a part to play in that, but so too does that thick dwarven armour. Again, vulnerable to armour piercing perhaps because of how their defensive stats are allocated, but it's kind of what you would expect from the dwarves anyway, and they are capable of dishing out a fair amount of damage as well, so basic shock infantry is not going to be enough to make a hole in them, and as long as you have them in and around pikes and around support, perhaps that potential maybe inefficiency more so than weakness because of their cost is going to be less easy to exploit. Speaking of scary units, however, they have one unit of dedicated bodyguard infantry nowadays, and that is the Dragon Slayers of Ered Mithrin. And this is the unit which is also effective against armour, so it's one of those shielded infantry units that has the armour piercing to it. Also the inspiration and fear effects, as is kind of commonplace with some of the standout bodyguard units in the game, are also both present in the Dragon Slayers, which is both useful. The inspiration effect for bolstering your nearby troops, but also because they have that slightly aggressive edge to them thanks to that armour piercing, they can also be used as kind of a makeshift shock infantry unit as well, should the need arise. And naturally when you go across to look at their stats as well, the attack score very, very high, which in conjunction with the armour piercing, again, when they go to face off against armoured factions, they are going to be well stocked for options of how to deal with them, especially when you factor in the crossbows, which we'll look at in just a moment. But also the defensive stats as well. I mean, defensive skill is high. The armour score is actually relatively modest, but the defensive skill more than makes up for that, and obviously the shield value as well. 2 hit points rather than 3, but again, I don't think there will be a unit of shielded infantry that has armour piercing that have 3 hit points. That's kind of the trade-off, and you can see that far more easily when you look at Khazad-dûm's roster, where you either have 2 hit points and armor piercing, or 3 hit points but no armor piercing, and it's really up to the situation as to which is going to be the superior offering. But again, EREBOR with that slightly more aggressive edge when it comes to their infantry. Even their more defensive units tend to have higher attack scores and armor piercing as well. It is a nice thing to have when you're maybe going on the attack. Even if you're defending in a siege, you can sally forth with some of these aggressive units, but do bear in mind that they may not have the staying power of some of the other Dwarven bodyguard units that you will see in, especially Khazad-dûm, but also thanks to weaponry, Ered Luin have a slightly more defensive edge to them as well, but from an attacking standpoint and the ability to dish out some punishment, the Dragon Slayers are pretty scary. Now then, the supporting units, the supporting cast, which are all important for EREBOR, because if you want to get the most out of your infantry force, you need to be able to use their supporting tools as well to good effect. And starting off with the Ironfoot axe throwers, and throwing axes really among the dwarves is the thing which EREBOR have, which is completely unique to them. Crossbows, you could argue that Ered Luin have got something fairly similar in the repeaters, although even here this is really where EREBOR sort of stake a claim on their uniqueness. Bonus fighting cavalry, which is good, but the main thing is going to be those throwing axes, the fact they have a 15 missile attack for only 650. That is not armor piercing, but still that's high enough to the point where anything you hit is going to feel it. And also in melee they're not half bad either, which is another useful trait. Maybe not quite on the same level as the standard Ironfoot warriors, especially when you consider there are far fewer of them, but at the very least we're fairly well used to the entry level throwing skirmishers of a faction having relatively lowly melee stats, but that is not true with EREBORs, which is good because again it allows you to augment their largely Ironfoot led front line with the equivalent skirmishers as well, and they won't be found wanting too much. But that is the key. I mean, 123 is not a huge amount, so you do need to look after them, but they're also not the easiest throwing axes to skirmish down from afar either, because they do have a big shield value, they do have big armor values, so in typical Dwarven fashion really they're going to be relatively hardy from long range, and you're going to have to bring something fairly impressive if you're going to be finishing them off quickly. But they do have to be close enough to other armor-piercing skirmishers to use their own throwing projectiles, so maybe that is an area where you would be a little bit worried about them. But that's perhaps where your other heavier skirmisher at the entry level comes in that can also deploy stakes, which is nice. The Ironfoot crossbows, which is maybe a little bit more well known in the EREBOR roster, but then that's because they've been a part of EREBOR's roster and indeed the Dwarven roster since time immemorial. 750 is a little bit more expensive, the missile attack of 10 is a little bit lower, but it is an armor piercing missile attack, and the way that crossbows work, you know, that stopping power is really, really impressive, especially in a siege. They do tend to struggle a little bit more to deal damage on the open field quickly enough because of the high reload rate. But again, as EREBOR, you don't really have too much of a choice when it comes to your skirmishing. You either do it with crossbows or throwing axes, or you don't do it at all and maybe invest entirely in an infantry force and go for the full-on rush on the open field, which, again, considering EREBOR aren't the quickest faction across the ground, may be a little bit of a worry. Again, similar story to the Ironfoot axe throwers in the sense that they too have decent melee stats, a lower shield value, so against some of the scarier units of archers, you know, they will be maybe a little bit more worried, but again, the armor score kind of saves them in this regard as well, so not the easiest unit to bring down, but again, some of the stronger Elven, Dunedain, Numenorian skirmishers are certainly capable of it, so it's one of those instances where EREBOR do have to be a little bit cautious at longer ranges and try and close that gap as quickly as possible so they can get involved. The high reload rate may also be a concern, but this is true of crossbows across the board. EREBOR in many ways do manage to, again, in similar veins to some of their infantry units, get around some of the weaknesses of the unit class, at least a little bit in the crossbows case, because they are going to be that little bit more resilient. But still, it's not really going to be easy for you to skirmish, but at dealing damage, we all know what crossbows are capable of. And speaking of which, one of the better units of crossbows the game has to offer, the Bodyguard tier Blacklock Engineers, although I say that, they only have 1 hit point. I've put them on this level because they are very expensive. 1 hit point maybe is a little bit of a concern, as they can still deploy their sharpened stakes, but they've got their specialty projectiles, huge missile attack of 20. I mean, again, the damage that they're going to be able to dish out if they're given a clear sightline is going to be pretty damn scary, and also they're not the easiest unit to skirmish down either, because they've got the high armor and shield values, although not that much more admittedly than the standard Ironfoot crossbow, so you are paying a premium for the huge missile attack and specialty projectiles that they do come equipped with. Again, and their melee abilities are also not hugely different from the units before, maybe a little bit more defensive skill, but you are paying a big premium on the bolts that they are loading into their crossbows. So again, there is a reasonable margin for error here. If you get it wrong with the Blacklock engineers, then it's going to be a large amount of money that has been flushed down the toilet. But if you get it right, the damage values will speak for themselves. And then the other bodyguard unit, we have another variant on the Dragon Slayers, the Dragon Slayers Trackers throwing axe unit, which also come equipped with, it is technically a spear, even though it looks like an axe, because the way they wield it is using the spear animations, and they have a bonus fighting cavalry as well. Effective against armor, which is also nice. I mean, a very good all-round unit this, because there's not too many weaknesses to them. They're very expensive at 1400, the most expensive on-foot unit that EREBOR can field, but that's because they have that huge missile attack of 15. They've got good melee stats as well, 12 melee attack, and also, you know, good armor-piercing damage. You know, the defensive scores are very high, armor of 10, shield of 12, good defensive skill. Also, using the spear animations means they will stagger enemy units more easily. All of those things are in their favour in addition to the 2 hit points, which is why they are so expensive. 1400 is a lot for a unit where, if you want to get the most out of them, you do need to be able to use those throwing axes of theirs first. But I do feel like in most situations you see EREBOR, you're going to see these guys, because even if they don't use their throwing axes, they're still good enough in melee to justify their position in the army, I would suggest. But also, you know, throwing axes, especially in a siege, you would expect this to be a relatively domineering unit. And in many ways, you could consider this unit to be EREBOR's most impressive in class that they have in the faction overall. Also, I just like the Dragon Slayer aesthetic. Obviously, it's very much the same here with these guys as it is with the standard Dragon Slayers. But yeah, I like the sort of blackened armour and the helms that they wear. So I'm glad that this is the bodyguard class of unit that has been made the base of EREBOR. Now then, the cavalry support that EREBOR have, which is a little bit more in-depth than what the other dwarves will have. People's opinions on the movie-style war goats may differ a little bit, but from a mechanical perspective, they are very, very useful. The lancers, I mean, the dwarven bonuses as well are a little bit different. They don't follow the same sort of 15/20 charge bonuses sort of template that the other cavalry from other factions tends to. They've got a charge bonus of 17, which is a little bit higher than the average for a standard unit of lancers. Also an effectiveness against armour off that charge, and in typical dwarven fashion, especially when you upgrade the armour, which I don't think makes any sort of difference to the model, indeed it does not, but gives them that little bit extra, which means you can boost their total defence to 25. One of the main issues that cavalry faces is you can take away a lot of their effectiveness by just poking at them with skirmishers, but it's obviously going to be a little bit more difficult when it comes to doing that to EREBOR, because they've got that high armour score, also high shield, reasonable melee defense. But EREBOR, like I said, it's a little bit difficult. Like when it comes to engaging with other cavalry units, you need to be a little bit careful. You need to sort of study what your opposition has brought, because 900 is a lot for an entry-level unit of lancers, and if you end up losing the cavalry fight heavily because you didn't consider what your opposition had, that can be a bitter pill to swallow. But also, your cavalry is hardy enough to the point where oppositions can't just send any old rubbish at you and expect to be victorious, especially when you consider some of their higher tier offerings. And we shall start with the chariots here, a reasonably scary force to behold, the Ironfoot Wargoat chariots. As is the case with pretty much any unit of chariots, looking at the stats is a little bit difficult to make any sort of judgment on them, because obviously you see the charge bonus of 40, the huge attack scores, both from afar and up close, and you think they're going to be devastating, but the way that they work means that they can be a bit of a flash in the pan. I mean, if they get bogged down in anti-cavalry units in particular, they can fall away very, very quickly, even with the 3 hit points. It isn't going to be enough to save them, especially against some of the scarier stuff like pikes, but if you use them as the living battering rams that they're intended to be used as, in conjunction with an infantry advance from your more defensive pikes and line infantry units and some of the more aggressive stuff like the Dragon Slayers and the Sons of Durin, in conjunction with it, which is why I said cavalry and chariots support as opposed to just cavalry and chariots, that's where you can really get the most, I think, out of EREBOR as a roster. But other than that, also the fact they are crossbow bolts instead of arrows is nice, because it means each individual one is going to do more damage, and it's going to be armor piercing. Obviously it causes fear as well, so you can really try and hammer home the crumbling of the enemy morale. And then the more traditional bodyguard cavalry, the Ironfoot Hammer Guard, 1600 is a lot, and if you are going to bring a cavalry force, you kind of need the hammer guard to be at the centre of it, to be the linchpin. Of course, they have that bonus fighting cavalry, so a good dedicated melee cavalry unit with very high defensive skill and armour. It means they can be a real pain to deal with, one of the scarier units of melee cavalry that the game has to offer, to be honest. The inspiration of nearby troops is, again, on horseback or goatback on this occasion, is maybe not the most important thing in their arsenal. But, you know, it's better to have it than not, and ultimately they're there to be cavalry hunters, and alongside the Ironfoot wargoats in front of them, who are more there for the numbers and, you know, the charge, these guys are going to be the ones to hunt down individual cavalry units and finish them off with those hammers of theirs. Big cost, but if you are going to go for that approach, they're kind of something you have to bring with you. And then finally, unique piece of artillery for them, we have the Iron Ballista over here, which, again, unique ballistae are going to be a little bit more reliable to use. I mean, it's kind of in the same vein as the Isengard Ballista, this, where you have something which is a little bit more effective as a ballista, but still with all of the useful things that a ballista has, like very good accuracy. Again, that reliability is nice. They do rely on sight lines a little bit more, but again, that's all about judging when they're on the field. It's also crewed by a unit of the EREBOR Legionaries, so you get 103 of them in for the deal as well. 1300 is a fair amount, even for a piece of artillery, but it always is an easier choice when you've got a unit which can ultimately perform as a unit of infantry, even if the artillery does nothing. Obviously, that's still a huge cost for a unit like this, but you know, if you can get just a little bit of damage done with the Iron Ballista, then you can try and make up the difference with the EREBOR Legionaries that crew it. So that is nice for them, and also having that reliability as well. If you dig into a position, you've got essentially the supersized crossbows and then the regular crossbows and throwing axes. Huge damage that can be done in tight confines. And also they have the range as well, so if you are going to engage at long range, this is truly your only option as EREBOR, to try and poke and prod the enemy to maybe make them move a little bit closer, and then maybe you move in with the main body of your army, is kind of the idea. You can't get away from the fact that EREBOR don't have any sort of archers or long range options in that regard, but they've got plenty of other things going for them that are very, very strong, that means that you can more than make up for that if you're willing to play chess with the enemy a little bit perhaps, and then be a little bit aggressive when the time comes, which the dwarves are by nature a little bit more defensive, but with EREBOR you've got to force that engagement first a little bit more than you do, certainly with Ered Luin, but also with Khazad-dûm, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, but not next. Next up we will talk about, we'll be going back to another human-based faction. They are the most common of all of the factions in Middle-earth after all, so we're going to be speaking about them a little bit more often. And it makes sense to talk next, I think, about EREBOR's closest allies, just a little bit outside the gates of the Lonely Mountains, and we shall talk about the Men of Dale. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for that.